At the climax of the Netflix movie Uglies, based on the popular YA dystopia from the mid-2000s by Scott Westerfeld of the same name, Tally Youngblood, played by Joey King, tells Dr. Cable, played by Laverne Cox, "But I won't be me," to which Dr. Cable replies, "But you sure will be pretty," which stands as the kind of thesis of the whole movie. And going into the movie, with the lead up and the conversation going into it, as a fan of the book from the mid-2000s, as evident by the fact that I reread the book before watching the movie, if nothing else, I was a little bemused by the fact that people were kind of confused by the concept of uglies, kind of starting conversation around the fact that, oh, but they're not ugly, which if you've read the book, you know is the central conceit of the book, to the point where the original cover had the tagline, "In a world of extreme beauty, anyone normal is ugly," which then kind of led me to the question, was this misunderstanding of the conceit of Uglies going into the movie a kind of product of media illiteracy, or was it a weakness and a failure of the movie and the marketing in relation to communicating that kind of central vision of the movie? And now, having seen the movie, which we are sitting down to talk about now, I think it's a little bit of both. But before we dive all the way into the movie, hi, my name is Melody. I talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, including a lot of book to screen adaptations, the most recent of which being Uglies. I recently reread the book, just the first one of the series, in preparation to watch the movie. And so I'm really ready to dive into what I think we are looking at with this movie, especially with my dramaturgy background and kind of knowing the different needs of storytelling on the screen versus the page. And I think that this is kind of unique in that I do not think it was a good adaptation, but I think it was a more faithful adaptation than a lot that we see. Now, as a millennial, I am used to disappointment in terms of the books I loved growing up being turned into movies. So I don't even know if I was fully disappointed by this as much as just kind of bemused and wanting to get to the bottom of why this thing that on its face looks like a very faithful rendering of this thing I loved does not have that same emotional resonance. And I think that there is a lot at play. There were a few changes made that seem somewhat subtle in the grand scheme of things, but did ultimately kind of change the trajectory of the movie, especially in relation to how we as an audience engage with Tally. And I think that this starts at the very beginning of the movie, which I will admit opens up in a way that I personally am not a fan of generally across the board. I do not enjoy an info dumping monologue, especially where it's just kind of info dumping the world to us, especially in contrast to having just reread the Uglies book. And if you watched my vlog adjacent video in rereading the Uglies book, I talk a lot, or at least a little, about how the book opens up very actively. And so we are getting to explore the world with Tally. And while we still have that opening sequence in the movie, because it is the sequence where Tally is slipping out to visit Paris after he has been ignoring her, and for anyone that may only have watched the movie, I feel it my duty to inform you that Paris is spelled P-E-R-I-S, because I don't remember if we saw that in the movie, but we have that sequence largely intact from her going through the pleasure garden, finding the pig mask, though it was rendered much differently than I expected. We run into Paris on the roof versus an elevator, but those are quibbles in terms of how we have adapted the book. So why does this sequence read so much differently between these two? And I think part of it is this difference in where we're starting. In the book, that is our start. We are getting introduced to the world around Tally through her going on this journey, while in the movie we have been given a lot of information just right at the beginning, just kind of fed to us at the beginning without us having any emotional connection to Tally. And Tally, our connection to Tally and the emotional stakes are going to be something that we kind of return to in this discussion, because I think it is the central kind of misunderstanding of the movie, or where a lot of it stems from or could have been fixed. Because I want to be clear, it was so evident in this movie that there was a great love of the source material in moments such as seeing the spag ball or the original hoverboard, which looked like the original hoverboard from the book in that kind of 2000s aesthetic with the cheetah print. So there were these touches that were very subtle and lived in the background. So we have like the moment with the spag ball where things aren't info dumped, but it is a nod and a reference to those who loved the book to appreciate. And so why do we have moments like that that really land really well, while also kind of misunderstanding where the story and the heart of the story really is? Because when I saw the trailer and I reacted to the trailer, I had concerns based on the trailer that the movie was reading a little bit too much generic dystopia. And I do unfortunately think that that carried over into the movie that I watched. Because while Uglies the book is clearly a dystopia, we are so tightly focused on Tally, and that was one of the things I discussed as well, was remembering or having to remember how we interacted with the world and how tight the world felt in the book because we were so focused on Tally. And from the beginning of the movie, then we almost have this kind of opposite in how we approach the world, in that it tried in the movie to blow the world open for us from the very beginning, and then to set these high stakes in relation to the world that didn't feel like they matched. Now, I will say in the movie, in relation to us seeing Tally and Paris together in the dorms, the Uglies dorms, I do think we dropped the names of these towns, Uglyville and New Pretty Town, which was probably for the best, or at least I don't remember them showing up as much as they do in the book, nor do I remember some of the iconic slang from the book showing up. I don't think anything was ever described as bubbly that I can remember. Correct me if I'm wrong, which really sent me in a kind of spiral of, is even our millennial fake slang dated? But that may have felt dated in terms of the lexicon. However, I would argue I think the whole movie ended up feeling dated anyway, unfortunately, and I think it had less of a vision and a voice than the book itself did. And so for a book that was kind of a precursor and the vanguard of the YA dystopia fad, it kind of comes off looking like a copycat in the movie if you don't know the trajectory of these stories. But swinging back to Tally and Paris, I do think that they were attempting to establish this connection and this emotional resonance for both the characters and us as an audience in relation to this friendship and these characters. And I understand that instinct. I think it is a good instinct, especially with some of the things we did with Paris later, which I actually think were very smart choices that weren't executed fully. So I like what we're doing there, but I don't think it actually accomplishes what it set out to do. And I think a lot of it circles back to the dialogue of this movie across the board. This is just kind of one of the first instances of it. It feels like the kind of monologue at the beginning, all of it feels very surface level. It feels very info dumpy. Nothing has any nuance to it, which then kind of spreads to the whole thing. And so this exploration that should resonate even more today, as much as at least, than it did when this book first came out, it ends up feeling very hollow. And we'll go to some of that. Put a pin in that. Remind me we want to go back there. But the dialogue itself is so info dumpy and it feels unorganic. I cringed when we were sitting in the graduation ceremony, which does not happen in the book, and they're just casually behind Tally and Paris talking about the smoke and David, which I understand what we were trying to do there, because in the book we have this idea of David as almost a kind of messiah figure, which in my sleep-deprived state will send me on a tangent with the life of Brian. But we were trying to establish that, but none of it feels organic, which I will probably say way too much over the course of this video. Rather, it feels like we're planting information. And so then none of that emotion kind of lands, and we don't feel the stakes of it. It just feels like we're being fed this information. And so Tally's journey is supposed to be spurred on by the fact that she has been left behind by Paris, and all she wants is to be a pretty. She wants to be a part of this world. She wants to fit in. And the entire arc of the book is her realizing that the world that she knows is not a full reflection of what the world is. Her eyes have been opened, and in that she also learns about the more sinister nature of being a pretty. And the entire concept of the pretty is really focused on at the beginning, but I would argue not in a way that makes it feel like we're in conversation with anything. We see Tally kind of adjusting her avatar of sorts, which I was hopeful going into the movie would be updated, and it was to a certain extent, like I said, to speak to the modern moment. So in the original book, we were much more in conversation with celebrity culture and magazine culture in particular, to the point where magazines themselves were mentioned in the book in a way that we don't see brought over to the movie. That I think, while I kind of understand that kind of streamlining of the narrative in that way, and it then being allowed to update in conversation with the current moment, I don't think it's actually in conversation with the current moment. So I do think that that is a weakness, or one of the weaknesses of the translation. So it's supposed to be in conversation with the insecurities of puberty. And here is one of the ways I think that aging up Tally, whether she was intentionally aged up or not, Joey King as an actress just looks older. And so I think because Tally in the Uglies are supposed to go into their surgery to become a new pretty at 16. And that is a very turbulent emotional time, if we can all remember, if we all even want to remember. And so that is on the cusp of something, and this idea of wanting to fit in is so prevalent, to be seen, to feel like you are someone. And I think that that is an even stronger exploration in the current moment, or it could resonate so much stronger because we could be engaging, like I mentioned in previous videos, with today's influencer culture. And I think we kind of attempted this with the way the avatars looked. And I think some people may have felt that the pretties didn't feel odd enough or like far enough, in that they were kind of modeled, in my analysis, to kind of resemble our influencer culture and what that looks like. And so I think it wants to be in conversation with that, but I don't think it succeeds in being in conversation about that. And I do recognize that this is kind of a hurdle of this adaptation, in that in the book, we are so tightly focused on Tally, we get a better internal kind of reflection of her. And so we know these inner wants and desires that we don't always have a correlating scene as explicitly for. And so I think that they could have added some stuff here. And honestly, they didn't really add too much, other than maybe some contraband transcendentalists. Listen, I had to do my junior AP English paper on the transcendentalists, and so that did kind of send me back. And so I think we were trying to make some of these explorations more active, in the sense that we were following Tally and Shay hoverboarding and Tally learning to hoverboard. And I will say, as someone who was very invested in the amount of hoverboarding in the trailer, I was very pleased with the amount of hoverboarding in the final product, even if that is what potentially dates it as much as anything. And I do think that the most unrealistic part of the movie was Tally's skirt and her being able to hoverboard in that skirt. But we kind of rushed through a lot of the emotional beats. And honestly, I don't necessarily want to rewatch the movie at this point, but I wanted to get my hands on the script. I wanted to kind of chart out the dialogue, which again felt too blunt for me. There was not enough nuance there, but it didn't feel like there were any opportunities for emotional beats within the dialogue either. It felt like the dialogue was very much intended both to reflect book scenes. I think that there was a fear of alienating book fans to a certain level, and I understand that absolutely, but I think it's also a kind of case for when you stick too closely to the source material, and I'm also not claiming it sticks perfectly to the source material. We will get into some of those bigger changes later, some much more successful than the others, but how that can limit you narratively as well. But within this dialogue, it felt clunky because it didn't feel like there were organic moments for them to be kind of pushing along in terms of their internal wants and needs. So we know that Shay does not want to be pretty. We know that Tally wants to be pretty. Their friendship doesn't resonate as much, I would argue. It feels very circumstantial. A lot of the stuff in the movie feels like it's just kind of happening, and it doesn't feel as connected, which means that as an audience member, I'm not as emotionally connected to what is happening. And that's even considering that I am bringing a love of the source material to the table. But one of the small changes that are actually very big, if we kind of are looking at the full picture. I talked about in my reread of the book how Tally was this normal person who stumbled in to these extraordinary circumstances. All she wanted, her main want and goal in the book, was to be a pretty, which actually in relation to acting beats, right? Once, that feels very actionable. And so I'm actually shocked that they didn't stick with these much more personal stakes, because I think one of the biggest mistakes of this movie was trying to make it feel bigger, in the sense of when Dr. Cable is confronting Tally and telling her she will not become a pretty until she goes after Shay and basically finds David for the specials. In the book, they are simply holding her desire to be a pretty over her head. It's a very personal want, and it makes sense, especially in the landscape of YA, where we've talked before about how the narratives are kind of figuring out how the world is so much bigger than you and where you fit within the world, which is all of what this is about. But instead of letting it live in those very personal circumstances and finding the heightened circumstance within the personal, which I think is incredibly actionable and interesting within that action, because we are then following a protagonist who is flawed and complicated and a little selfish, and she's having to kind of contend with that. And in some ways, I'm wondering if they were afraid of making Tally unlikable, similar to the kind of weaknesses of the Artemis Fowl movie, which was one of the last big kind of disappointments in terms of books that I have such a strong emotional connection to with my childhood or from my childhood, that did not or do not have the best movie after waiting literal decades to get said movie. So instead of letting it live in this very personal place, which I also think is inherently more active as well, because then you are playing the personal and seeing how that impacts the bigger picture, which I would argue is what the book is exploring. But in the movie, we decide that those stakes are not high enough, and we need to imply that David has a weapon, which is what sends Tally to the smoke, what convinces her to do this thing, which makes no sense, because one, the kind of escalation of that just doesn't make sense. Why Tally cares doesn't make sense. And even within this world that they've tried to establish, it just doesn't make sense. And so then we have these artificially heightened stakes kind of hanging over everything. And instead of increasing the urgency, which is what I think that they were aiming to do with that, it makes everything feel cornier because it doesn't ring true. And then with that choice as well, we are removing a lot of the nuance. And the nuance, honestly, is kind of removed across the board in terms of what we're exploring with this idea of uglies and pretties, because all of that nuance is stripped away. There is an attempt to engage with it, but I do not think it succeeds, because we are just seeing the superficial, but even the superficial seems like a parody and a stripped down parody of something. I think that there was so much opportunity to engage in a conversation about how we view ourselves, what it means, especially today when we are kind of viewing ourselves through these filters, and how we talk about Instagram face place. I think there was so much potential to engage with conversation there, which just ultimately fell incredibly flat. Even when things like Tally breaking into the party at New Pretty Town to see Paris does, I think, want to go to that place. I think with the aesthetics and the dialogue of it, it wants to be there, but it just doesn't succeed. And so then we are pushed to the smoke while only having these kind of rumblings, which, to be fair, is more than Tally gets in the book because it's just kind of sprung upon her, which I honestly like. I like that she is just this girl living her life. She's got her nose down. She just wants to become a pretty. She's kind of getting through her last days before this big life milestone, and then her entire life is upset at this crucial moment, and she doesn't feel in control, but in spite of that, she has to make some really big decisions. And in the movie, we are taking a similar circumstance without any of the emotional weight attached to the character as an audience member. And I will argue in the book, not all of the dialogue is great. I'm sure a lot of that dialogue is clunky. They may have lifted some of the dialogue exactly, but exposition and dialogue reads much different, I would argue, on the page than on the screen. And so much of the dialogue on screen doesn't have any inherent action behind it. I didn't always have a sense in a scene what these characters actually wanted. Rather, it was about moving the story along. And so because these characters couldn't find their footing, or their wants didn't seem to have organically grown out of something, it just felt really disjointed and awkward and uncomfortable and cliche. So that by the time we get to the smoke, which moves even quicker than it does in the book, it feels like this very stereotypical resistance, when in the book, there are these levels of critique to it as well. We have this acknowledgement that there are a lot of these uglies that ran away before becoming pretties and really didn't have an idea of what it was going to mean to live in the wild. Tally is concerned about how she's seeing trees chopped down. It talks about David's shoes, which are just cobbled together. I will say, in relation to David's character, he does feel more fleshed out than in the book, because in the book, he can feel like this kind of Messiah-esque stand-in figure. And in the movie, we get to complicate that a little bit. We get to see some of his disappointment and his betrayal, though those emotions and the kind of beats of those are expedited from in the books. We don't really get to see him and Tally traveling alone after some of the fallout of the smoke. There are some things that are kind of consolidated, and some of the things that are consolidated narratively do make sense. For instance, they get rid of the firefighters and turn the firefighters into the Smokies, and so the Smokies are kind of battling the invasive species of this flower that in the book is just some specials from a neighboring town that help people travel to the smoke. And so narratively, that makes sense to kind of consolidate that, and it also gives some more action to the Smokies and immediately opens up Tally's eyes to the world and gives her a sense that maybe her world, or what she knows of the world, isn't exactly true right away. I also like that Tally and Shay's tension in the smoke is born of Shay seeing through some of Tally's motivations, even if she doesn't know the full context of those motivations, rather than it being jealousy over David. Though at the same time, for a couple of 16-year-olds, I think having a crush on the same person is a very real experience, and I really did kind of sympathize with Shay in that, as well as it did open up a wider conversation in the book, in that Shay was kind of idealizing David and turning him into this figure and seeing him as a figure rather than as the person, and it did really kind of contend with that idea. But then with Tally being in this place and the kind of function being the same as in the book of Shay wanting her to fall in love with this place and make her fall in love with this place, though Shay isn't really, she shows her around, but not in the same way as in the book, because again, we do get rid of things like the library with the magazines, and Tally getting to kind of challenge her experience or perception of the world in that way, and us as an audience then getting to do that as well, which further complicates the ideas of uglies and pretties, right? So instead, in the movie, it just starts to feel like this generic stand-in, and we're not really engaging with them, even if we are talking about later in the smoke what it means to become a pretty. So by the time that we challenge that idea, I don't know that I really have an idea of what a pretty was before. And I also don't know that Tally has begun to deconstruct her idea of being a pretty and what that desire is rooted from and how she's engaged with it. However, she talks about how she's really fallen in love with the smoke, and I don't know that I believe it. It doesn't feel like there has been the room for that. We've had all the right scenes, right, that should be pushing the action to that place, but the emotions of those scenes have not felt true. It just feels like a thing that is happening. And so again, I think it's this sense of the dialogue and the action not matching up, or there not being an equivalent action that's really forwarding the dialogue and the emotions that we are supposed to be getting to. And I think that there is the opportunity, or there was a way, I'm not gonna, tell you how, but I think that there was a way to kind of get there and to have and use the medium of being able to visually tell this story to help fill in some of these gaps. And we have kind of moments of that with montages and flashbacks, but I don't know that it actually is really doing anything. Now, a major change that I actually did kind of appreciate, even if it didn't play out ultimately in the way I expected it to, was Paris, one, being more of a presence. I think we are, in terms of the arc of this, setting up Paris more as a potential love triangle than in the book, where that is not prevalent, or at least he's not the member of the love triangle that appears. R.I.P. Zayn, the TikTok girlies, would have loved you. However, I do like that we take Paris and make him a little bit more prevalent, because he is what ties Tally to her before. He is a representation of that. And we see a little internal conflict in him as well in terms of his relationship with Tally and what their friendship represents. And they did really try to build out the emotional weight of that friendship. I definitely see those attempts. I don't know if they were always successful for me as a viewer, but they were definitely there. And one thing that I think was a really great touch then was seeing Paris become a special. Even if we are not fully unpacking the idea of specials yet in this movie, to be fair, we don't yet in the book either. And so then we see him enacting some of the major action that in the book happens off page in relation to some of the emotional fallout for David, without spoiling anything too much just in case. And so where we leave Paris at the end of this movie, I don't know. Like, is that the end for him? I do not know, because it seems like that's too good of an opportunity to emotionally consolidate that storyline, and it feels like we have purposely built that out for a reason. So should there be a sequel, which based on the reception of this, I don't know that we're gonna get, I would be interested to see how they're going to do that. Now, it is interesting thinking about this in context of a sequel, because the book ends and the movie ends on the same cliffhanger that is very intentional. And let me tell you, when I first read this book as a teenager, that was a cliffhanger. Like, that was like a knife in the chest kind of moment. And thinking about how it lands in the movie is interesting, because I don't know that it has the same weight, the same impact. I don't know that we have gone as much on this character journey. So if we talk about in the book things being so focused on Tally and that emotional journey, that emotional resonance, and seeing the world open up as Tally's world opens up in relation to the movie, which tries to do that to a certain extent. But at the same time, I think it really is trying to build out this kind of elaborate dystopian world that viewers are more used to seeing, flying Cybertruck adjacent things and all. And so it loses some of that distinctness, because I think that Uglies' strength is in its character forward nature and in that social commentary, which feels very reductive, because at their heart, any good dystopia really is a social commentary. But for me, I don't think that this movie fully understood what that commentary was and or engaged in it enough for that ending moment, which I'm gonna spoil a little bit, so go away if you don't want it spoiled, to land in that it's that thing of you get the thing you wanted, but by the time you get it, it's a punishment, not a reward. And that is so powerful, impactful, and as cliche as it probably feels now, especially when I first read it, it was so novel. It was an oh shit moment. And so I think that there is a way to still capture that while acknowledging that it's not, you know, as novel as it probably was for readers when they first encountered it, but I still think it's such a good moment. And even the reveal of it in the movie, I don't know how I felt about it, in that it felt kind of tacked on, even as I recognize that it is supposed to be mirroring the opening sequence and how Tally's daily life looks in Uglyville, whether we call it that or not, and how that kind of mirrors the end, especially like some of those shots. I really still do like the shots of like all the windows that we do see in the trailer. And so in that respect, I think they are kind of building it out so that they are reflections of each other. But then what commentary are we adding to that? And there's all of this potential that is never fully realized. And I don't think we have to spell it out. I don't think we need to beat the audience over the head with it, but I think that there is nothing for the audience to truly engage with on that front, and rather it just feels like a more stereotypical kind of shallow villain that we are fighting against in terms of the big bad of this world, rather than also kind of like looking into ourselves and what this represents, as well as within the book. It's almost so normal in a lot of ways, which stay with me, because it almost is kind of like reflecting growing up when it's talking about the stages of the pretties. And so it is also kind of engaging with this idea and this fear of growing up and this desire to grow up, this desire to become an adult, become pretty, especially if we're looking at this time of 16. So we're coming out of puberty, we're coming out of those awkward stages, and then becoming what we're becoming. New Pretty Town kind of mirrors the college years, and then the development continues to mirror what we're used to, but it's making us engage with what our future looks like as a young adult reader in a way that it never feels like we're engaging with that in the same way in the movie. And it doesn't have to be the same conversation in the same way, but I would like there to be a conversation. And so in attempting to make the world feel bigger, it feels like we have actually made the world smaller. And because of that, we are not engaging with that cultural criticism as much, which means that those who do not see that criticism in the narrative, while there is an attempt to communicate it, and it is there in very broad strokes. And so I would argue that you should know as a consumer, as a viewer, that there is something along those lines that is being engaged with. It's just not necessarily successful. And so are things like background actors at the beginning of the movie totally engrossed in their avatars enough of a kind of commentary? I don't know, but I think that not engaging in that enough is part of the reason people are confused. And if the commentary and that conversation isn't successful enough, is it completely the audience's fault that they are confused? I think it's a lot more nuanced, similar to the conversation. I don't think it's all or nothing on either side. At the same time, I do think that there was a lot of love for this source material evident. I ultimately just don't know that it was successful in translating the intent or the heart of that source material on screen, even if the heart for that source material was evident. If you understand what I'm saying there. And if not, I do not blame you. I'm sure we could continue to sit here and talk about things, but I think those are kind of my big overarching thoughts, and I would be very interested to hear yours if you watch the movie, both if you've read the book or not, because I do think it is important for an adaptation to be able to stand on its feet even without a knowledge of the source material. You have to be able to tell a successful story in the medium you were telling that story. So let me know what you're thinking. Thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts as always. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.